Hello, Health Science 3052 students. This is Professor Van Dyke with your Week 5 video. I'm going to post your first midterm on Thursday, so keep that in mind. You have this video and you want to take a look at this material. It will be covered on your midterm that's coming up on this Thursday. So the midterm is going to be Thursday, September 24th. The study guide is already up, and I definitely encourage you to take a look at that. It should be pretty self-explanatory. The exam will be posted on Thursday. I usually give you a lot of extra time to work on the exams. I want you to do really well in this course, and hopefully that will minimize some of your stress, that you won't have to have it done in exactly an hour and 50 minutes. It may work out well for you to take it earlier in the day, and I encourage you to do so. Now keep in mind as well, your paper and your presentation are coming up, and you have the dates for those under the announcements. I gave you an important dates announcement a couple weeks ago, so I encourage you to look at that to make sure that you're ready for the paper and presentation as well. So make sure that you have a good grasp on that. And as I mentioned before, your presentation is not just merely a PowerPoint. What I want you to do is, if you're going to do a PowerPoint, make sure and do a voiceover for that, or just go ahead and do a video like I do with your cell phone. I'm perfectly happy with that as well, but I want to see you present. So keep that in mind for your presentation and your paper. But more importantly, make sure that you're prepared for this Thursday, September 24th, for your first midterm. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and run through the material. We're talking about toxic substances today, and we'll move through these fairly quickly so that you can start preparing for your first midterm. We're going to talk about toxicology. We've already talked about risk assessment, some toxic substances, and by no means are these a comprehensive list. These are kind of some of my favorites to talk about, so we'll go ahead and move through them fairly quickly. Moving on to slide 2, with toxicology, we already talked about LD50, which is the lethal dose that's going to kill half of your test subjects, and we're generally going to be dealing with rodents and things like that. But we certainly can look at lethal concentrations, LC50s as well, and this is going to be when you're primarily dealing with like things in the air, composition, concentrations of maybe things like chlorine gas that are in the air. So definitely a very important area of study as well. With dose response curves, we look at the toxic substance, which is going to be on the x-axis, and then mortality along the y-axis. So this can be very important, and certainly with mortality, we can also be dealing with things like adverse effects. So things that are beyond the no observable adverse effect level can also be listed on the y-axis. Sorry. Okay, so on to slide 3. So this is a general dose response curve, and as you can see, you have the percentage of the dead on the y-axis, and then you have the dose along the x-axis on the bottom, and it's pretty easy to find. So when you're looking at LD50, obviously you're going to look at that value of percentage dead on the y-axis, and this is going to give you an LD50 dose response curve. And then on to slide 4. This is a dose response curve that I give to individuals, and I ask you to guess what it is. This is actually for alcohol. This is a dose response curve for alcohol, and again, it's not a true LD50, but it is a dose response. So as the dose increases, your responses go from no effect at all, that no adverse effect level, all the way up to death at the very top end. On to slide 5. These are some general terms that I want you to understand. So no observable adverse effect level, certainly that threshold upon which you have no effect on an individual, and then acceptable daily intake. We talked a little bit about that as well, where you generally assume that no one will ever exceed the acceptable daily intake, but certainly we do. We also have safety dose factors, which are designed to protect individuals, to say, okay, here's the no observable adverse effect level, here's the acceptable daily intake. We're going to take these values and we're going to multiply them by 100 or even 1,000 to make sure that people are really very well protected. Now, we talked about risk assessment already, and again, I want to reemphasize how important risk assessment is. We look at the hazard identification, the dose response, the exposure assessment, and risk characterization. These are things I really want you to understand how that process is actually generated. And you do this on a daily basis with regard to risk assessment in your own lives. Should I do this? Should I not? Is it a danger for me to text and drive? Things of that nature. So we always do risk assessment, but we're quantifying it now and being able to apply it to an occupational setting. So very important. I really want you to understand risk assessment, so make sure that you know this very well. On to slide 6. Toxic substances have been around forever. And again, I tend not to read everything that's on the slides because I anticipate that you're going to be reading these as well, that you're going to have an idea of what's going on. But we've really started to note these as early as 370 BC with Hippocrates looking at lead poisoning and saying, yes, in fact, this is dangerous. Now, we tend to forget history, as you know, because we were exposing workers in leaded gasoline plants to large amounts of lead. We were still using lead in paint that would peel off and kids would eat the paint. So definitely we tend to forget a lot in regard to what we've learned in the past. And you have Hippocrates, the same Hippocrates as the Hippocratic Oath, all the way back at 370 BC, looking at these things and saying, wow, these are dangerous. We should protect people from these. On to slide 7. So the first we're going to talk about is polychlorinated biphenol, which is fairly commonly used and certainly not used today, but had been used throughout the past. The thing that was interesting about PCBs was that they're like an oily liquid to a waxy solid that is low water solubility, high in fat solubility, but it was very heat stable and didn't conduct electricity very well through it. So it was used in transformers and PCB, in a lot of electrical equipment that would allow for protection from the workers. Now the problem was that it was bad for the environment and it was bad for the people that came in contact with it. So PCBs are still used in third world countries, but certainly not here in the United States so much. We do still come across them on a regular basis, though. So they're used in, onto slide 8, they're used in transformers and capacitors, hydraulic fluid, carbonless paper, all kinds of different stuff. And they actually were using these to control dust on roads for some time. So very dangerous for the environment, but certainly something that at the time they used on a regular basis. They didn't give it much thought. Onto slide 9. So how are we getting environmental contamination from PCBs? We have a discharge from waste from industrial sources that gets into waterways and can be very dangerous, all the way down to food exposure, inhalation and absorption through the skin on humans. But you have a lot of industrial accidents, and certainly we're still finding old pipes and tanks and things like that are underground that had large quantities of PCBs in them. We just recently found a large number of pipes in Riverside that were ruptured when they were trying to put in an apartment complex, and they were full of PCBs. So now that location is a Superfund site. And of course, you all remember what a Superfund is. On to slide 10. So PCB public health threats. You have animal toxicity and can have a very negative effects on small mammals. It can cause liver disorders and miscarriages. And again, liver cancer, but this was done in rats. This study was done in rats, and while it hasn't been done in humans, for obvious reasons, you can't test on humans to find out if this does in fact cause liver cancer in humans, but you certainly would have an indication that this would be very bad for humans. And then you can have occupational exposure, which can cause burning of the nose, ears, throat, liver ailments, and chloracne as well, which is a skin condition that is much worse than like dermatitis. So PCBs can be very dangerous. On to slide 11. So in order to clean contaminated areas, they have to be heated at a very high temperature, because as you remember, it's very heat stable. So it has to be heated up to above 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a real challenge to actually do. The Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976 banned production, sale, and use by Monsanto, and so they did stop their production. But as you can see, from 1929 to 1977, they had produced an extraordinary amount, over 1.4 billion tons of this material. So I should say 1.4 billion pounds of this material, which was an extraordinary amount that Monsanto had made and shipped worldwide. On to slide 12. One of the things that's interesting about this, and we'll talk a little bit about environmental justice, PCBs were actually one of the reasons that people started to look at environmental contamination and considered taking grassroots efforts. So in the summer of 1978, the Ward PCB plant deposited 31,000 gallons of PCB-laden waste along a stretch of highway, and then it ended up in 1982 in an unsecured landfill, which is now a Superfund site. And this was really a very dangerous process. And when I lecture in class, I spend a lot more time talking about this, because environmental activism is an important component in regard to how we get things done for protection of the environment, and certainly with regard to how we deal with things currently. We've really seen kind of a more lax approach in regard to how the EPA is funded and protected when they look at these things, and bringing lawsuits against heavy waste production and disposal. On to slide 13. Again, this is just a continuation of what the Ward PCB plant actually did. I mean, they basically thought no one would notice, so they drove up and down a highway and were just dumping the materials on the ground, which was just a horrible thing, very bad for the environment. On to slide 14. Again, you can see individuals that were really willing to lay down their lives to keep them from dumping these materials into a landfill that was very close to where they lived and ate and worked and had their children playing outdoors and things like that. So that's slide 14. On to slide 15. We're looking at dioxin, or TCDD. So dioxin is not manufactured. It's not intentionally made, but it's formed as a byproduct from utilizing herbicides. So when these herbicides are exposed to the landscape and then they're burned, they create what's called dioxin, which is very, very dangerous for individuals, and we'll talk a little bit about that. On to slide 16. So dioxin has a fairly long half-life in soil of about 10 years, and it can be found in the soil and dust, wood-burning stoves, places like that. You can find it in fish tissue and animal fat. So the adult population does tend to have an exposure to dioxin, but certainly if you work in the military, you're going to have a higher percentage of dioxin that will be found in your tissue. On to slide 17. Some of the toxic effects. So it does interfere with the immune system. It does show fetal toxicity. It has teratogenic effects in mice. It can cause cancer and fertility issues, certainly fetal loss, sexual behavior activities, dysfunctions, and things like that. On to slide 18. So we talked a little bit about, again, chloracne, and chloracne can definitely be caused by dioxin. So this slide 18 is an image of chloracne. This was a before and after. This was Viktor Yushchenko, who was a Ukrainian politician. So they tried to kill him with dioxin. They dosed him with dioxin in some of his food, and the result was chloracne. He's still a very influential figure in Ukrainian and Eastern European politics, fighting for human rights and protection from environmental contaminants, and a very interesting fellow. But look up his story, and while the test questions are not going to be specific to Viktor Yushchenko, it may be an interest to you to know a little bit more about this individual. On to slide 19. This would be the time that I would ask you, does anybody know what's occurring in slide 19? And I wish that I was there to have a conversation and have dialogue with you, but certainly we don't get that opportunity. So this is utilization of Agent Orange, which was a defoliant. And as you know, dioxins occur when you take pesticides and you apply high heat to them. So essentially what would happen is we would fly through these areas and we would dump Agent Orange, and then we would come through and bomb them extensively. And then we would send in U.S. military to go in and look for individuals in these areas. So they were exposed to dioxin at extraordinarily high levels, and it's one of the reasons that so many Vietnam veterans are suffering today from exposure to Agent Orange. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of what was taking place, and dioxin was one of the leading reasons for this. On to slide 20. So with slide 20, we talk about lead. 3 to 4 million children have high blood levels of lead in their bodies. Mostly this is coming from poor water supplies. Now again, a lot of you are interested in talking about lead exposure in water based on the Flint water incident. Now I want you to understand the lead wasn't actually in the water until they switched water supplies. And what ended up happening was that the water that they were using was slightly more acidic. And when it reached the homes had lead soldering and pipes and things like that began to degrade. And it increased the level of lead that was in the water. And it had a very negative effect on the individuals that were actually drinking that water. On to slide 21. So a lot of uses for it. It's used in cosmetics and glazes and paints, most certainly. Car batteries, ammunition, TVs, old TV tubes, leaded gas, which fortunately we don't use here anymore, but ceramics. You can still find it in lead crystal goblets and things like that. We still manufacture a great deal of it. We use it very readily in things like car batteries and things like that. It can be used in radiator repairs and because of its malleable nature. So there's a lot of lead still floating around out there. On to slide 22. So routes of entry are going to be through an ingestion, lead-tainted food and water, canned foods and things like that as water passes through lead pipes, airborne residue from gasoline if you worked in a lead processing facility. You certainly could be exposed to that through an ingestion process. It causes low birth rates and gout, and certainly mental retardation. So that's one of the reasons that it's so important to make sure that very small children are not being exposed to lead. And as you know, kids experience the world through sensations, and a lot of the time they will actually eat lead-based paint when they see it peeling off an old house. So it can be very dangerous. But most certainly that mental retardation component is one of the reasons that lead is so important to us. So as you can see, that brain damage starts at 45 micrograms of deciliter or higher in the blood. And then children they tend to be treated with a chelating agent. So it's like a lock and key that enters into the body and removes the lead from the body. But very important. And one of the important things I want you to take from this is that lead is stored in bones and teeth when it's locked away into the body. So it can be very dangerous because it is stored away in your bones and in your teeth. That may be a test question. I'm not sure. I can't remember. So 23, onto mercury. Mercury is a liquid metal, also known as quicksilver. It's been used for a very, very long time. It's used in the manufacture of plastics and slime retardants, used in paper making, fungicides and paints, alloy and dental fillings. Keep that in mind. That probably is a test question. So it's used in dental fillings, so has been used for quite some time. So if you're a dental hygienist, you may be exposed to this alloy that can be very dangerous to you. So keep that in mind. It's used to treat syphilis in 16th century in Europe, and what a horrible treatment that would have been. But certainly mercury can be very dangerous for individuals that are exposed to this. It can, certainly has been used in textiles and things like that in the past. On to slide 24. Sources for mercury exposure can include coal burning and mining activities, but textile manufacture as well. So this was actually the reason that the Mad Hatter went mad, was because they were working with mercury and they were being exposed to this mercury. It can also be exposure routes through incinerations and things of that nature. On to slide 25, some of the health effects. It can be very toxic for your liver and your kidneys, the lung membrane, but it also has an effect on the brain as well, substantial effect on the brain. On to slide 26, we'll talk a little bit about cadmium. Cadmium is a soft silver white metal that is toxic. It's used in electroplating and NiCad batteries and things of that nature. So if you work in around electroplating, you can very frequently be exposed to cadmium, which is very dangerous for you. On to slide 27. Exposure again can occur through cadmium tainted food or smoking tobacco. It can be bioaccumulating in the food chain, and it has toxic effects on kidney and bones, so it can be very dangerous. And you think about this exposure rate, the exposure route of being from food or from smoking. It's basically the same process. So I'm smoking a cigarette, I'm handling it with my hands, I use my hands to do some electroplating. I get cadmium on my hands, I pick up a cigarette, I put it in my mouth, and you can see how easy that exposure will occur. Same thing with food. So I'm holding a sandwich, I eat that sandwich, and my hands had cadmium on them. It can be very dangerous. On to slide 28, which is asbestos. Asbestos is a hazardous substance which is incombustible. I usually spend a lot more time talking about this because it's something that we're facing currently. If you watch television, you probably see a lot of ads for mesothelioma, and it was because of the nature of asbestos being incombustible that it was used as a fire retardant in ships. So Navy workers were very frequently exposed to asbestos, but we also used it in schools and government buildings because we knew it wouldn't burst into flames. So asbestos is fairly dangerous. It's called a 6 silicate mineral because there are 6 different forms of asbestos, and certainly some are more commonly used than others because of the nature of their material, and how they're easy to use and how they're utilized for fire retardants. But it turns out that they tended to be the worst ones in regard to creating mesothelioma, asbestosis, breathing conditions like COPD. On to slide 29. Here's an image of the 6 silicate minerals. On to slide 30. These are some of the uses. So we use them for ironing board covers so they didn't burst into flames, pot holders, theater curtains, brake lining. So you've heard of a company called Ray Bestis. Ray Bestis was a great brake lining company because they used asbestos for their brake linings. But this is a naturally occurring material, so it forms, you can have exposure to it in outcroppings and certainly mining and factory use of asbestos. On to slide 31. We've already talked about some of the health effects. You can get asbestosis, which is a chronic condition which causes scarring of the lungs. You can have liver cancer, which is synergistic with smoking. So if you have essentially asbestos exposure and cigarette smoking, you're going to increase your rate for lung cancer. You have mesothelioma, which is a marker disease for asbestos exposure, and then gastrointestinal cancer, for obvious reasons. As this stuff is passing through an individual, it can get lodged in the esophagus, stomach, colon, and rectum. Slide 32. Asbestos risk kind of depends on time, so it has a latent period. So you get exposed to it when you're a young individual, and then later in life you start to develop asbestosis and things like mesothelioma. But it also has to do with the size of the fiber that you're exposed to, the age the exposure occurred, things of that nature. So again, a very important component Now, for the longest time, the violation cost for utilizing asbestos and not removing it was about $5,000. So exposure to asbestos was more common in the past because, frankly, it was cheaper just to leave it in place and not have to deal with it than it was to have it removed and taken to a secure landfill. On to slide 33. So we have some abatement options. We have encapsulation, enclosure, and removal, which is certainly the best strategy for asbestos. But encapsulation involves coating the asbestos with a polymer sealant so that it doesn't have any further releases. But certainly if you do some demolition, you might be exposed to these encapsulated areas. We also have enclosure, which is small area effects, and basically separate that small area from the remainder of the building by a non-permeable layer, like a Hepalon liner or things like that. But certainly removal is the best strategy. If you can remove this and take it to a secure landfill and lock it away in that secure landfill, that's going to be the best means for removing asbestos. So that was the presentation. Again, don't let your paper and your presentation sneak up on you. Make sure that you take a look at the important dates that I posted in the announcements section so that you're aware of what's going on. And most importantly for this week, make sure you're ready for your first midterm, which is Thursday. And again, I tend to leave it up for a much longer period, so check it and find out when it's up. I generally will post it early in the day so that you have plenty of time to work on it, and I will leave it open well through the end of the night, fairly close to midnight. So keep that in mind. You have time to do your midterm, but don't put it off. Work at it at the time that's best for you. Obviously, the longer you have the midterm up, the more likely you're going to run into problems. So make sure not to do that. Read your study guide, be prepared, and do a great job on midterm 1, and that will set you up for great success in this course. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful week. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I look forward to your questions at william.vandyke@csusb.edu. So thank you and have a great day.